Microtonality is perceived as being perhaps the scariest topic in all of music. Even at so-called Berkeley parties, you bring up quarter tones and people suddenly look at you like this. But still, I think there are some really cool mainstream examples in video games. While doing the research for this video, I realized how little I actually knew about the topic, at least from formal education. I was going to reach out to Walking Microtonal Encyclopedia Savage for help, but I just couldn't put together the email. Alright, so let's jump right into it. What is microtonality? To answer that, we have to ask the opposite question, what isn't microtonality? Go to your nearest piano and hit any note you want. If your piano's perfectly in tune, or if you have an electronic keyboard like mine, every single note you're playing is considered to not be microtonal. Instead, it adheres to a tuning system called A440 12-tone equal temperament. What a disgusting phrase. Let's break this down. A440 simply means our A in this octave is tuned to 440 Hz. Hertz is just a measurement of how quickly a waveform oscillates. A faster oscillation and the note becomes higher. A slower oscillation and the note of course sounds lower. Our A sound wave at 440 Hz oscillates 440 times per second, and all of the other notes are relative to this tuning, but we'll talk about that more in a second. In terms of those other notes, the 12-tone part refers to the fact that we have 12 distinct notes to work with before looping around again. Say we start on that A, we can walk up 12 notes before arriving back on A again. And the final part is this equal temperament. The physics gets a bit involved, but essentially the ratio between the frequencies of any two notes remains consistent even if you transpose them elsewhere. Take for instance our A440 and the A an octave below. You'll notice that this forms a 2-to-1 ratio. If we keep that distance, 1 octave, the same, and just move the notes elsewhere, say for instance C to C, despite the uglier numbers, we still keep that 2-to-1 ratio. This principle applies to any distance, of course, even smaller ones. Our 12 notes in equal temperament divide the octave into 12 equal parts, which is why you'll also see 12-tone equal temperament referred to as 12 equal divisions of the octave, or 12 Edo. We'll talk more about equal temperament versus its arch-nemesis later, but that's essentially all there is to A440 12-tone equal temperament. So the obvious question is, why is my piano tuned to A440 12-tone equal temperament? And it's not just my piano. Listen to literally any of the top 100 pop songs right now. You would be hard-pressed to find anything that even slightly breaks out of this tuning system. Open up your favorite music-making application, it's all built around A440 12-tone equal temperament. So why is it like this? The short answer is, it's all arbitrary. A440 gained popularity hundreds of years ago and was eventually chosen as an international standard because people thought it sounded cooler than other tunings for A. We have 12 tones to work with because it's a nice number. And we use equal temperament because it allows instruments tuned in equal temperament to transpose, or play anything in any key on any starting note. I think this last one is probably the least arbitrary and makes the most practical sense. But anyways, now we can answer what microtonality is. By most definitions, it's anything that isn't found within the constraints of A440 12 tet. Well, that's rather silly for a few reasons. Firstly, it gives a very broad name to something that is outside of the constraints of a very specific tuning system, which isn't inherently wrong, but it gives a sense of otherness and hierarchy to concepts in music, which I feel is kind of wrong. A440 12 tet is colloquially just called standard tuning, and notes outside of this system are colloquially called out of tune. This proves to be more problematic when you consider both the Western-centric origins of this tuning system, as well as the breadth of different cool-ass tuning systems in other parts of the world. Or even if you're someone who goes outside and touches grass, you'll hear that bird song doesn't adhere to 440 12 tet, or whatever other random noises you hear. My point is, microtonality in music isn't taught in schools, apart from being treated as some arcane knowledge reserved only for the likes of Colliers and Gizzard Wizards. But it's not. Microtonality is cool and can appear in any tune just like any other concept. That being said, because of the ubiquity of 440 12 tet, many applications of microtonality are hard to find in the West. But that makes it all the more interesting, since often its appearance is a deliberate choice. So let's start taking a look at some video game tunes which feature microtonality. Our first example is from Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. I know I talked about this game in the last video, but there are just too many bangers, such as the de facto theme of the game. might be wondering, where is the microtonality? The entire theme is performed at A432 Hz, slightly flatter than A440. Let's listen to the difference. It's actually rather noticeable. So why was A432 used here? All of the tracks in this game that were composed by Michiru Yamane were tuned to 432, while the others were tuned to the standard 440. Yamane has gone on record saying she likes the meditative and healing sound of 432 versus 440. Though she hasn't explicitly said, 432 also fits the Baroque-style soundtrack of the game. In this era, tuning wasn't standardized and was often lower than 440. This makes the tuning itself a deliberate artistic decision. She had to manually alter the tuning of both her MIDI instruments and live studio players. It's pretty cool because it's an often overlooked method of expression for a composer, versus things like just chords or the notes. You can detune the entire piece of music in any direction. A432 does still appear fairly often, even in modern American popular music. Off the top of my head, it was used in Childish Gambino's Redbone. Producer Ludwig Göransson allegedly tuned it to 432 for that kind of psychedelic funk quality. This is similar to Yamane's usage, using the tuning for the purpose of genre, or a type of feeling. So the question is then, if you don't have perfect pitch, is there really an objective difference in how different tuning systems or even different keys feel? Of course not. I think, like all art, the artist's intent in no way directly translates to the viewer or listener's perception. It's possible you hear A432 and think that it sucks, or even more likely, you don't hear or feel the difference at all. And I think that subjectivity is what makes art cool. Many grifters nowadays will try and sell you on the so-called healing benefits of sine waves played at A432, lauding its supposed origins in the fabric of the universe or something. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there listening to it like this. This next example is from Red Dead Redemption 2. During a scene where protagonist Arthur Morgan is building a house with his buddies, this little tune kicks in. So we're in standard A440, and none of the notes are written explicitly as microtonal. But listen to the performance of all of those E's and E flats. We have these bends in and out. And sure, pitch bends are very common in many types of music, but what I love here is how imprecise and unmeasured they are. These are called blue notes. Its name coming from the blues and the blues scale. Blue notes are essentially all of those spicy flat notes, the notes that superimpose that minor flavor over the otherwise major sound. The cool thing is though, blue notes are often instinctively played slightly flatter than what would otherwise be considered in tune. This tune is no exception, of course. These E flats aren't even really E flats, they're just bluesy E's that bend in but don't quite hit E. Blue notes are common in the American blues idiom, which was derived from spirituals and field hollers sung by African American slaves, which itself was derived from traditional West and Central African music. The bending and unique tuning of blue notes are very likely the result of the alternate tuning systems in some types of African music, which we'll circle back to in a second. But what I love about blue notes is that they're essentially the only example of an anti-microtone in the West. Its ubiquity throughout all derivations of the blues genre makes it not only natural, but almost necessary. But at the same time, it's also not intentional. When musicians sing or play instruments in a blues style, they're not consciously trying to hit microtonal blue notes, it just feels right. And that's cool. So now we're getting to the yucky part, micropolytonality. Polytonality is when two or more parts in a tune are in different keys at the same time. If you want to hear some examples, I talked about it in my polytonal rap video. But micropolytonality is when you throw microtonality into the mix. Our first example is the whistling section of KK Cruisin' from Animal Crossing. Such a banger tune, but what is happening here? We're in the key of E flat minor, and the guitar at least is tuned to standard A440-12 tet, but the whistling sounds off. It's detuned, played sharp by 50 cents. 100 cents is the distance of a semitone, like B to C or C to C sharp for instance. So upwards by 50 cents means that instead of the key of E flat minor, you could say the whistling is in E half flat minor, or rather, halfway between E flat minor and E minor. Let's take a look at the difference if the whistling was in just regular E flat minor. It's rather noticeable. It's interesting because it's definitely deliberate. Mr. Slider sings the prior and following parts perfectly in tune, but the whistling is so consistently sharp. Maybe it's meant to be a joke or something. But what isn't a joke is the next micropolytonal example, this time from Wario Land 4. What a hectic tune. Similar to KK Cruisin', we have a grooving bass line that is in a D minor kind of flavor, but these wailing melodic notes are detuned. All of those Ds are about 13 cents flat, the Es even more flat by 38 cents, and that single F very flat by 81 cents. In Wario Land 4, at the end of every level, there is a timed escape sequence where the world begins to fall apart and you have to run back to the start to leave. As the clock begins to tick down, the music gets more intense and unhinged. By this point in the music, you probably have like a minute left, and the game sadistically reminds you of your time constraint by playing these jarring microtonal stabs. The notes getting progressively flatter as they go higher makes the melody sound so strained. You can even hear other instruments in the background also microtonally sliding downwards in pitch. I suppose it's a bit of a misnomer to say this is micropolytonal though, since the melody doesn't seem to adhere to any consistent tonality that I'm aware of. But either way, definitely a wacky example of a microtonal lead superimposed over an otherwise D minor sound. Also, the cent differences are approximate, not only because they're rounded up or down, but also because I destroyed my ears trying to hear 1 cent differences. So if anyone has the MIDI data and knows the exact cent difference, please let me know in the comments. So speaking of cents, we mentioned that 100 cents is the distance of a semitone, giving us 1200 cents between an octave. What this means is, if we divide the octave by 24 and fill in every 50 cent interval between these semitones, that gives us a 24-tone chromatic scale. If we take this one step further and have a note every 25 cents, that gives us 48 tones. This is what happens in a section of the intermediate race music for Marble Madness. I'll start a bit before that for context. Simply bananas. This section features these circusy jumping chords in 5/4, which is already a bit difficult to follow, but then we have this melody. For the next 3 measures, the melody is pretty convincingly in a sort of 48 tet kind of vibe. I realized while transcribing this that I actually have no idea how to notate 48 tet, so the notation looks kind of horrible. Here's a version notated in 12 tet, but with cent differences above each note. The thing is though, 48 tet doesn't mean random. There seems to be a rhyme and reason to the scale used here. This B half flat, D half flat, E 3/4 flat, G 3/4 flat appears together often and creates a sort of motivic repetition in the melody. Whereas the Wario Land example flattened the notes to give a kind of strained quality, here in Marble Madness, we're previously in a dark E flat tonality, and then the melody splinters into these 48 tet notes that are slightly higher than expected, giving a super off-kilter kind of feel. Its place in the game is very fitting. Similar to Wario Land, you're on a time constraint to make it to the end of the level. The microtonality matches the kind of teetering, circusy feeling as you're rolling around obstacles and off ledges. To me, these kind of chiptune microtones remind me a lot of when I would go to the Vietnamese mall with my grandmother and get one of those toys that played inexplicably microtonal covers of Disney music. But anyways, splitting the octave into smaller equal temperament parts is definitely one of the most robust and intentional examples of microtonality, and this tune barely even scratches the surface. Divisions like 19 tet or 22 tet quickly lose similarities to 12 tet, and leads to really interesting harmony that is otherwise impossible in 12 tet. Despite the last few rather unsettling examples, this one is actually rather pleasant to listen to. Let's take a look at a quick break from Cuphead.
It's nice to rest your eyes and maybe go outside. Grab a book and get some air. So what are you waiting for?
So before we talk about some things that are happening here, we have to briefly take a quick break to discuss physics, specifically the harmonic series. The harmonic series is the building blocks of most sounds. Anything with the discernible pitch, like singing, strumming a guitar, or even tapping a glass, produces a series of vibrations that we perceive as pitch. The lowest vibration is the fundamental frequency, from which overtones or harmonics are produced. The first overtone produced on top is twice as fast, or in music terms, an octave higher. Then, the next overtone is 3 times faster than the fundamental, then 4, then 5, 6, 7, 8, etc. into infinity. The first 8 overtones, including the fundamental, sound like this, if using A1 as our base. Transcribing those first 8 notes on sheet music gives us something like this. But this isn't exactly accurate, because the sheet music assumes 12 tet, and these frequency ratios slightly differ from that tuning. This E, for instance, compared to 12 tet, is 2 cents sharp, which is almost imperceivable in most cases. But then after the octave, we start seeing larger differences. This C sharp is 14 cents flat, the E is 2 cents sharp again, and this G is a whole 31 cents flat. So what is the point of all of this, and how does this apply to Cuphead? The harmonic series is abundant in nature and the fabric of sound in the known universe. The intonation of the clean, low whole number ratios makes it rather intuitive to us and forms the basis of the tuning system called just intonation. Without being too exhaustive, just intonation is a tuning system where the distance of every note in a scale, relative to the root, is in a relatively clean ratio. The advantage of this tuning system is that harmony produced in just intonation has kinder sound waves. The alignment of the frequencies in these cleaner ratios means the harmony is quite literally more consonant. We've taken more than a quick break, so let's hear some examples using Cuphead. Listen to that E flat chord on eyes.
It's nice to rest your eyes.
It's just so ringy and harmonious. This is due to the singers tuning the chord to just intonation, at least to the best of human ability. But this necessitates the third of the chord being sung ever so slightly flat, relative to 12 tet. This can be heard to an even greater degree in that last chord of the section.
What are you waiting for?
The cool thing is, these dominant 7 chords appear verbatim in the harmonic series, with a ratio of 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 between the frequencies. This is in contrast to the 12 tet dominant 7 chord. Let's listen to both back to back. 4 The former just sounds so crisp and pure, whereas the latter has a kind of wobbly sound. Barbershop quartets typically intuitively sing in just intonation for this very purpose. That pure, luscious quality of barbershop is owed to these clean ratios. And it's not just barbershop. The human ear is able to discern and calculate the consonants of these ratios, so just intonation or similar tuning systems have appeared in folk music all throughout the world. Even the aforementioned blue notes could be attributed to just intonation in African folk music. So the question then is, if it sounds so good and has a precedent in nature, why is 12-tet so common? Just intonation has a few downsides. The most important downside is that it's a relative system, meaning that the tuning of all of the notes are ratios that are relative to a fundamental. What this means is that a just intonation piano has different ratios for every single key signature. In fact, equal temperament was designed as a solution for this. The temperament part refers to the fact that the notes alter just intonation ratios to create a single consistent logarithmic curve that contains every single note. Though this allows the same ratios in every single key, apart from the power of 2 octaves, every other just intonation ratio is lost. To be honest, there's enough depth in just intonation to write a separate full-length 1-hour video essay on, but I'll just let you guys watch one of the many great videos already on YouTube. Not only for the sake of brevity, but also because we're reaching the point where I'm getting very unqualified to continue talking about physics. I got a C in high school physics. Sorry, Mom. One last thing is, I feel like I would be remiss in not addressing the fact that just intonation shouldn't be, and thankfully isn't, commonly considered to be explicitly microtonal. Not only does it have a rich history in music from many different cultures, but it's also literally based on immutable concepts in physics. 12-tet is largely arbitrary even though we were collectively gaslit for hundreds of years. Nonetheless, I find just intonation interesting to talk about in the context of this video, because despite all of these things, I couldn't think of a single tune on the American radio that could be justly intonated. But anyways, speaking of tuning systems in other cultures. I frequently preface things with Western this or common in the West that. Shout out to Dave Slam Jam for noticing that. The unfortunate fact of the matter is, modern music theory is very Anglo-Eurocentric. There are also many videos that go further into this, but my point is, it's an unfortunate truth that from a system standpoint, Stevie Wonder's Language We All Understand is homogeneous old European sheet music with old European tuning systems. But sometimes, concepts and techniques that are exclusive to other cultures are able to make relatively big appearances in modern popular contexts. One of my favorite examples is from Kirby's Superstar. This track is really cool. At first glance, we have some half-flats, so we could easily analyze this tune as 24-tet. But the specific notes that are half-flatted combined with notes that aren't create a variation of the Arabic Maham Rast scale, which sounds like this. In Trees in the Depths of the Earth, we add that flat 6 for this kind of fusion-y composite minor feel. It's just such a cool sound, and it feels respectful to the scale and the culture behind it. The usage isn't a caricature, and from what I understand, care is taken to respect the specific conventions of the scale, such as using the flat 7 instead of the half-flat 7 in the descending passages. But at the same time, it's integrated into that Kirby sound, and there's a really neat synthesis between these so-called Western conventions and Arabic modality. And that's something I wish happened more often. This kind of synthesis not only creates new ideas and sounds in music, but also drives discussion and appreciation for the music from other cultures. Music theory is kinda stale, and I feel the objectivity and elitism is not only counter to the point of music theory, pun intended, but is also just narrow-minded. But anyways, though this sounds like a conclusion, by chance I found one more tune within this category I'd like to talk about. I started playing this game called Venba the other day, a South Indian cooking game that really scratches the cooking mama itch. At a certain point, you hear this tune. That last run is super cool, because essentially what happens is that the singer kinda just does a slow run down in pitch from that C sharp into an F sharpish note at the very end. The pitches notated here just show the contour, and it's really an indiscriminate, albeit still tonal, vocal run. I actually had no idea what was happening here, or the precedent in South Indian music, if any. But I reached out to composer Alpha Something, and he said these kinds of descending runs do indeed have a precedent in Tamil music, giving me a few examples such as this one. And that's super cool. The soundtrack is heavily inspired by Tamil film music, and it's cool to see different aspects of that. Go play Venba and listen to the soundtrack, it's banger. Super mega thanks to Alpha Something for replying to my questions. Now before I conclude the video, I'm happy to announce that my Patreon is now live. If you enjoy these silly little music theory videos, please consider supporting me there, and you'll receive some cool perks as well, like being included in the credits of my videos, receiving access to all of my transcriptions, seeing some behind the scenes footage, and more. Link is in the description. One final thing is, this video is essentially the most basic intro to a few different types of microtonality. Not only is microtonality in itself a flimsy concept, but there are so many possible ways to break A440-12 tet. I'm not even aware of most of these ways, quite unlike my beginner violin students. Okay, one more time. Lightly row, first line. You got it.
Okay.